In the summer of 1931, Germany was a nation teetering on the edge. The Great Depression had devastated its economy. Unemployment soared, and desperation was spreading like wildfire through the streets. Amid the chaos, one state stood at the heart of the storm: Prussia. Once the proud foundation of the old German Empire, Prussia had now become the battleground for the future of democracy itself. The social democratic government that ruled Prussia represented one of the last strongholds of the Weimar Republic's fragile democratic ideals. But its enemies were closing in. To the right stood nationalist groups like the Stahlhelm veterans, who longed for the return of old imperial glory, and the conservative NIMP, both furious at what they saw as a weak, corrupt, and disconnected leadership. To the left, the Communist Party waited for the Republic to crumble, eager to ignite a revolution of its own. Then came the spark: a referendum. The right-wing coalition pushed for a national vote to dissolve the Prussian government, accusing it of betraying the German people. They claimed that democracy had failed that order. Strength and unity could only return through decisive, authoritarian action. It was more than just a political maneuver. It was a test of whether the German people still believed in freedom and constitutional order, or if they would surrender to the rising tides of extremism. In this single moment, history paused. The world watched as Germany, still scarred by World War I, still burdened by debt and humiliation, began to drift toward the darkness that would soon consume it. The outcome of the Prussian referendum would determine not just who ruled one state, but whether democracy itself could survive in the heart of Europe. As we explore this critical turning point when the forces of democracy, fascism, and communism clashed over the soul of a nation, we uncover the fragile balance that defines every free society. The story of Prussia in 1931 is not just about politics. It is about power, fear, and the dangerous seduction of simple answers in desperate times. Before we begin, if you enjoy learning about the hidden moments that shaped our world, the struggles, choices, and turning points that defined history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell. Every week, we bring you stories that reveal how the past continues to echo in the present. Now, let us step back to 1931, to Berlin's crowded streets, where hunger met anger, and where the first tremors of a political earthquake were about to shake the very foundations of Germany. At the heart of this growing storm stood the Prussian government, a coalition led by the Social Democrat Speed, joined by the Catholic Zentrum Party and the liberal German Democratic Party DEP. Together, they had spent years holding the line against chaos, symbolizing what little remained of democratic stability in a nation slipping toward extremism. To many Germans, Prussia was more than just a state. It was a symbol of order, discipline, and continuity. But by 1931, that symbol had become a target. The Speed-led coalition believed deeply in the ideals of the Weimar Republic. They saw themselves as the last guardians of democracy, struggling to maintain a sense of law, decency, and human dignity while the rest of Germany seemed to crumble. Their leaders knew that if Prussia fell, the Republic itself would be doomed. Yet, outside the walls of their government buildings in Berlin, the mood of the people was changing. The Great Depression had emptied wallets, shattered families, and filled the streets with despair. Political faith gave way to anger, and anger sought easy answers. From opposite ends of the political spectrum, two powerful forces rose, both vowing to destroy the government, though for entirely different reasons. On one side stood the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler. They promised to rebuild Germany's pride through unity, discipline, and vengeance. To them, The Prussian coalition represented weakness, the old politics that had betrayed the nation at Versailles and allowed poverty and humiliation to spread. The Nazis despised democracy not because it failed, but because they believed it could never succeed. They wanted a new order, one ruled by strength and national will. On the other side were the communists, the Keyed, who saw the Speed as traitors to the working class. To them, the Prussian government was not a defender of the people, but a shield for the capitalist system that exploited them. While the Nazis blamed Germany's suffering on foreign enemies and internal traitors, the communists blamed it on the bourgeoisie, the industrialists, and the very democracy that allowed inequality to thrive. Both movements drew their power from desperation, from the sense that Germany's existing system had failed its citizens. Both sought revolution, but one dreamed of a nationalist empire, while the other envisioned a workers' utopia. The Speed found itself trapped between these two roaring waves of hatred. The party's leaders tried to hold on to reason, while the world around them was losing it. They implemented emergency measures, sought to maintain public order, and begged for patience and understanding from a public that had lost faith in everything. But their cautious optimism was no match for the energy of the extremes. In the streets, the Nazis and Communist Red Front fighters clashed in brutal skirmishes. Violence became a form of political expression, and blood on the pavement replaced debates in parliament. Each week, newspapers carried stories of shootings, riots, and assassinations. Ordinary citizens grew afraid to speak their minds, unsure whether their words would mark them as enemies in someone's eyes. The middle ground, the space where democracy lives, was shrinking fast. The Prussian government still claimed legitimacy, but legitimacy meant little when power was shifting to the streets. The Nazis gained millions of votes by feeding on national pride and anger, while the communists rallied the unemployed and disillusioned workers who no longer believed in compromise. The Speedist dream of preserving democracy now seemed almost naive. They still held Prussia, the largest and most powerful state in Germany. But the walls were closing in. The right accused them of being traitors to the nation, while the left called them enemies of the revolution. Surrounded by fire, the government stood as a lone island of civility in a sea of extremism. And yet, their greatest danger did not come from one side alone, it came from the unholy convergence of both. The referendum of 1931 brought this conflict to a breaking point. The right-wing Stahlhelm and Dimpy pushed for it, demanding the dissolution of the Prussian government. Their motives were clear: destroy the Speed's authority and clear the path for authoritarian rule. The Nazis eagerly joined the campaign, using the vote as a propaganda weapon to paint the Social Democrats as corrupt and out of touch. But behind the scenes, curious and dangerous alignment was forming. Though the Nazis and communists despised each other, both saw the same target: the democratic government standing in their way. For one brief and cynical moment, they fought on the same side, not as allies, but as twin destroyers of the same enemy. In the smoky halls of Berlin's political clubs, the irony was not lost on the few who still believed in reason. How could two ideologies so opposed in theory, one dreaming of racial purity, the other of class equality, find themselves working toward the same goal? The answer was simple and chilling. Both rejected democracy, both despised moderation, and both saw compromise as weakness. To them, the Speed was not just another party. It was the embodiment of everything they sought to erase. As the referendum drew closer, tension filled the air like an approaching storm. Propaganda flooded the streets. Posters screamed promises of salvation. And the people, exhausted and uncertain, were caught between two nightmares. Some still hoped that reason would prevail, that Prussia's long history of order and discipline would hold firm. But history rarely shows mercy to those who hesitate in the face of fanaticism. In that fateful year, 1931, Prussia stood as the final battlefield for democracy in Germany. The choices made there by politicians, by voters, by ordinary men and women trying to survive would echo far beyond its borders. Within 2 short years, those echoes would turn into the thunder of marching boots and the silence of a nation that had surrendered its freedom. And it all began here, with a government standing alone, surrounded by enemies, fighting not just for power, but for the very soul of Germany. By the summer of 1931, the air in Germany was thick with uncertainty and anger. The political storm that had been brewing for years was now gathering into a tempest. On the surface, the struggle seemed simple: the right against the left, nationalists against revolutionaries, chaos against order. But beneath that surface, something strange was taking shape, something that defied logic and ideology alike. It was a moment when hatred of democracy became stronger than hatred of one's enemies. And in that madness, a most unlikely alliance was born. In July 1931, from far away in Moscow, Joseph Stalin made a decision that would shock even his closest followers. Watching Germany's political turmoil unfold, he saw an opportunity not to strengthen the working class or to defend socialism, but to destroy what remained of the Social Democratic Party. The speed. To Stalin, the Social Democrats were not comrades but traitors, social fascists, as he called them, who stood between true revolution and the victory of communism. And so he gave his order, the German Communist Party. The key was to throw its weight behind the right-wing referendum to dissolve the Prussian government. The order made no sense to those who still believed in the purity of Marxist ideals. How could the communists side with the very forces they had sworn to destroy? The monarchists, the nationalists, and the emerging Nazi movement? But logic was irrelevant in Stalin's cold calculus of power. The speed was the immediate obstacle, the last thread holding together Germany's fragile democracy. If that thread could be cut, chaos would follow, and from chaos, perhaps, the revolution would finally rise. In the smoky rooms of the KP leadership in Berlin, confusion turned to grim acceptance. Orders from Moscow were not to be questioned. Overnight, propaganda that had once denounced the Nazis as enemies began to echo their calls for the downfall of the Prussian government. Posters appeared side by side, one bearing the swastika, another the hammer and sickle, both demanding an end to the same democratic system. It was a moment of political surrealism. The far right and far left, united in their hatred of the center. For the Social Democrats, the betrayal was devastating. They had long believed that, despite their ideological battles, there was at least one thing that all sides could agree upon: the rejection of authoritarianism. But now, they found themselves completely isolated. The communists accused them of defending capitalism, while the Nazis accused them of destroying the nation. Surrounded and vilified, the speed clung to power in Prussia as though holding back an incoming tide with bare hands. On the streets, the new alliance played out in scenes that defied reason. Communist and Nazi agitators, who only weeks earlier had fought each other with clubs and pistols, now shouted similar slogans. Their rallies, though separate, echoed the same sentiment: the government must fall. For ordinary Germans, it was bewildering. The line between left and right seemed to vanish. All that remained was rage at the system, at unemployment, at hunger, at a world that had promised hope and delivered only despair. Stalin's strategy was as ruthless as it was effective. By turning the communists against the Social Democrats, he deepened the fractures within Germany's working class. The unity that might have resisted fascism was destroyed from within. While the Kate fought the speed, the Nazis grew stronger, feeding on the confusion and presenting themselves as the only force capable of restoring order. Hitler, ever the opportunist, watched with satisfaction as his two greatest rivals, the Communists and the Democrats, tore each other apart. The referendum campaign itself became a theater of political absurdity. The Stahlhelm and D led the official effort. calling for the end of the Prussian government. The Nazis poured their energy into street propaganda, transforming the vote into a test of loyalty to their movement. And, astonishingly, the communists joined in distributing leaflets that echoed the same accusations as the far right, insisting that the speed was the true enemy of the German people. Democracy, already fragile, now faced attacks from every side. When the day of the vote came, the results were both a relief and a warning. The referendum failed to reach the required majority, saving the Prussian government at least on paper. But the damage had been done. The image of unity among the defenders of democracy was shattered. The people had seen how easily the extremes could align when it suited their purpose, and how powerless the center had become. The speed had survived the vote, but its moral authority was broken. In Moscow, Stalin showed no regret. To him, Germany's turmoil was merely a step in a longer game. The destruction of the Social Democrats weakened Western socialism and paved the way, he believed, for the eventual triumph of communism. But what he did not foresee was that his decision would help clear the path for something far darker. The alliance he had forged, however temporary, had legitimized the idea that democracy was the enemy, that compromise was failure, and that strength, no matter how brutal, was the only answer. In the months that followed, the world moved closer to catastrophe. The Nazis capitalized on the chaos, winning more seats, more followers, more control. The communists continued their fight, blind to the fact that their actions had strengthened the very movement that would soon crush them. And thus, exhausted and betrayed, watched helplessly as the foundations of the Republic crumbled. Looking back, the events of July 1931 read like a political nightmare, a moment when ideology gave way to cynicism, and short-term strategy destroyed the future. It was a reminder that democracy does not die only when enemies attack from without. It also dies when its defenders are divided, when pride and hatred outweigh unity and reason. In that summer, as Stalin's order turned rivals into strange allies, Germany took one more irreversible step down the road that would lead to dictatorship, war, and the loss of millions of lives. When the sun rose over Berlin on the morning of August 9, 1931, it cast a pale light over a nation holding its breath. Posters from both extremes still clung to the walls, torn and weathered from weeks of furious campaigning. The referendum that had divided Germany was finally at hand, a vote that would determine not just the fate of Prussia's government, but perhaps the fate of the Republic itself. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with suspicion and fatigue. For months, the streets had echoed with slogans, promises, and threats. Now, it was time to count the voices of a wary people. Polling stations opened across Prussia's vast territory, from the factories of the Ruhr to the quiet villages of East Prussia. Men and women lined up in silence, some clutching their ballots like weapons, others staring ahead with hollow eyes. To vote was to take a side for or against the government, for or against democracy. The Social Democrats and their allies had urged restraint, pleading with citizens to stay home, to deny legitimacy to what they called a reckless assault on constitutional order. Their message was not one of passion but of caution. Do not be drawn into the madness. Do not give the extremists the power they seek. Meanwhile, the right-wing parties and their unexpected partners, the communists, waged a campaign of fury. Their message was simple and intoxicating: the government had failed, and only by dissolving it could Germany be reborn. In speeches and pamphlets, they painted the Prussian leaders as the embodiment of decay, bureaucrats clinging to power while ordinary people starved. The Nazis, with their unmatched propaganda machinery, turned the referendum into a test of loyalty to their vision of national revival. Every vote against the government, they claimed, was a vote to restore Germany's dignity. As the day unfolded, it became clear that the turnout was lower than expected. Many citizens, exhausted by years of political strife, chose apathy over conviction. Others, loyal to democracy but frightened by the violence in the streets, heeded the peace call for boycott. By nightfall, when the polls closed and the ballots were gathered, the outcome was both decisive and ambiguous. 90% of those who voted had chosen to dissolve the Prussian government, an overwhelming rejection in numbers. Yet, the referendum had failed. The law required that at least half of all eligible voters participate for the result to be binding. The turnout had fallen short, not by a small margin but by millions. The extremists had won the argument but lost the battle. In the counting halls, as officials tallied the results under the flickering lights, a strange silence filled the air. It was not the roar of victory nor the cry of defeat, but something colder, the sound of a nation unsure of what it had just witnessed. For the Speed and its allies, the result was a fragile relief. The Prussian government would remain intact, spared by the apathy of the public and the discipline of those who refused to legitimize the attack on democracy. Newspapers supporting the Republic hailed the outcome as a triumph of reason over fanaticism. Editorials spoke of a symbolic victory, proof that the German people still valued order and legality over chaos and demagoguery. But behind the triumphant headlines, fear lingered. Everyone knew the truth. The Republic had survived not because it was loved, but because too many had lost faith in all politics altogether. In the Nazi headquarters, the atmosphere was different. Though technically defeated, Hitler and his inner circle saw opportunity in the outcome. The overwhelming percentage of votes in favor of dissolution, even without the quorum, was proof of their growing influence. They did not need legal victories. They needed momentum, and momentum they now had. The referendum had given them visibility, legitimacy, and the illusion of inevitability. They had stood shoulder to shoulder with millions who shared their contempt for the democratic state. And that was victory enough. The communists, too, claimed success. Following Stalin's orders, they had helped weaken the Speed, deepening the divisions within the left. They argued that the referendum's failure was irrelevant, that the real outcome was the exposure of the Social Democrats' impotence. In their rhetoric, the boycott was cowardice, and the entire process proved that parliamentary democracy was obsolete. Thus, in their own way, both extremes emerged stronger. While the fragile foundation of the Weimar Republic grew weaker still. In Prussia's government offices, the victory felt hollow. The ministers who had fought to defend the constitution knew that the numbers told a darker story. If 90% of voters had chosen dissolution, then democracy's defenders were now a silent minority. It was only a matter of time before the next assault came, perhaps not through ballots but through force. The streets of Berlin already hinted at what was to come. The brown shirts of the Nazis marched more confidently now, their rallies growing larger each week. The communist demonstrations grew louder, angrier, more desperate. Between these two tempests stood a government that had no army of its own, no private militia, and fewer believers. When the final results were published, international observers called it a reprieve, a small but significant stand against extremism. But history would later see it differently. The failure of the referendum did not mark the restoration of democracy, but its last gasp. It revealed a nation deeply divided, where faith in democratic governance had eroded beyond repair. The people had not saved the Republic. They had simply postponed its fall. In the quiet after the storm, as the posters were torn down and the ballots forgotten, a dangerous illusion settled over Germany. The Weimar Republic still stood, its institutions intact, its leaders still speaking of peace and stability. But its foundations were hollow. The enemies of democracy had tested its strength and found its weakness not in laws or procedures, but in the hearts of the people. For when nearly an entire nation votes against its government, even if the law protects it for now, the soul of that government is already fading. In that strange summer of 1931, Germany's fate was not sealed, but the path ahead had become clear. The Republic had won the battle for legality, but lost the battle for loyalty. The referendum's failure would be remembered as a symbolic victory. Yet symbols alone could not stop what was coming. Within 2 years, the men who had led the failed campaign to destroy the Prussian government would rise to destroy the Republic itself. And when that day came, there would be no more thresholds, no more ballots, and no one left to stop them. The day of the referendum was supposed to be a democratic exercise, a moment when the German people would speak through ballots, not through violence. But by the time the sun had fully risen over Berlin, it was clear that words and votes would not be enough to contain the fury that had been building for years. The city was a powder keg, and the referendum was the spark. Across the capital, the tension was almost visible in the air. Posters were ripped down, barricades hastily built, and columns of uniformed men filled the streets. The police, outnumbered and exhausted, stood between two movements that no longer believed in law, each certain that only force could bring justice. By midday, the situation began to spiral. In working-class neighborhoods where the communists were strongest, crowds gathered, chanting against the government and against the Nazis who paraded through the same streets with flags held high. The brown-shirted storm troopers of the Saar marched in disciplined lines, their boots striking the pavement in perfect rhythm, their songs echoing through narrow streets like a declaration of war. In response, the Red Front Fighters League, the communist paramilitary, mobilized its own members, armed not with rifles but with clubs, iron bars, and a desperate rage born from poverty and humiliation. Berlin became a battlefield in miniature. Stones flew through the air. Windows shattered. Shouts turned to screams. Police forces rushed from one district to another, sirens wailing, trying to separate mobs that refused to be controlled. In some areas, officers found themselves firing warning shots just to clear the streets. In others, they were forced to take cover as bullets cracked from unseen corners. By evening, the chaos had spread beyond Berlin's industrial districts into the heart of the city. Streetcars were overturned, fires burned in the distance, and the smell of smoke mixed with the summer heat. Newspapers would later report that several people had been killed that day, their lives lost not for ideology but for the illusion of it. A few were shot during clashes with police, others beaten by rival mobs. They were workers, students, party loyalists, names that would soon be forgotten in the flood of history. Yet their deaths told the story of a nation that was already unraveling. The violence was not an accident or an excess. It was the logical consequence of years of hatred and manipulation. To those who still believed in democracy, the day was a nightmare. They had hoped that the referendum, even if misguided, might at least prove that political conflicts could still be resolved through lawful means. Instead, it showed the opposite. It revealed how thin the veneer of civilization had become, how quickly slogans could turn into bloodshed, and how fragile the Weimar Republic truly was. Foreign observers, watching from afar, struggled to make sense of what Germany was becoming. Only a decade earlier, it had been one of the most advanced nations in the world, home to philosophers, engineers, artists, and scientists who shaped modern civilization. Now, its capital resembled a city under siege, where citizens fought one another in the name of abstract causes, and where the police no longer represented authority but survival. Every street fight, every smashed window, Every act of retaliation chipped away at the foundation of trust that democracy needed to survive. The speed-led Prussian government watched these events unfold with a sense of dread. Their message of restraint urging people to stay home and refuse to participate had saved them at the ballot box. But it had not saved the peace. The violence on referendum day revealed that their control was slipping, not just politically but physically. They governed a state whose citizens no longer recognized one another as compatriots but as enemies. Each side saw itself as the true Germany, and the other as a disease that had to be eradicated. For the Nazis, the bloodshed was proof of their narrative. They pointed to the chaos as evidence that democracy had failed, that only a strong hand could restore order. Their propaganda machine seized on every image of street violence, every headline about riots, to argue that the Weimar system was collapsing under its own weakness. Hitler himself, watching closely, understood the power of perception. He knew that fear could do what persuasion could not. It could drive the middle class, the cautious, the uncertain, into his arms. The communists, too, saw the clashes as a kind of victory. To them, every confrontation with the police or the Nazis demonstrated the brutality of the system they wanted to overthrow. The blood of their comrades became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against both fascism and capitalism. In their speeches and pamphlets, the fallen were turned into martyrs for a revolution that never came. Thus, even death was weaponized, transformed into a tool of propaganda in a war where truth no longer mattered. By the time night fell over Berlin, the city was scarred. Broken glass glittered under the streetlights, like tiny fragments of a shattered dream. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Yet, in official statements the next day, both the right and the left claimed triumph. The government called for calm, promising that order would be restored. But deep down, everyone knew that something irreversible had happened. The line between politics and violence had been erased. And once that line disappears, it rarely returns. In the following days, citizens tried to resume their lives, but the mood had changed. The referendum had failed legally, yet it had succeeded in exposing the truth. Germany was no longer a nation debating its future but one tearing itself apart. The violence was a warning, but few recognized it as such. Instead, it became routine, a prelude to what was coming. Political killings would soon become headlines, intimidation a part of daily life. The democratic experiment, already frail, had been mortally wounded not just by words or laws, but by the blood spilled on its own streets. Historians would later look back on that day as a grim ominous snapshot of a society that had lost faith in dialogue and surrendered to fury. The clashes in Berlin were not just riots. They were rehearsals for the years ahead, when uniforms would replace ballots, and obedience would silence dissent. In 1931, the Weimar Republic still existed in name. Its officials still held meetings. Its parliament still passed decrees. But the spirit of democracy, the belief that differences could be resolved without violence, had already died that day. The sound of marching boots, the chants of rival mobs, the gunfire echoing through Berlin's streets, all were whispers of the darkness about to descend. As Germany spiraled deeper into its own internal struggles, the rest of the world seemed to mirror its turbulence. In China, devastating floods claimed millions of lives, washing away entire provinces and leaving behind a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable scale. In Britain, the financial crisis shattered the confidence of an empire once thought unshackable, forcing it to abandon the gold standard and reshaping the global economy. Yet amid all the despair and uncertainty, there were also glimpses of a new era, moments that hinted at humanity's relentless drive toward progress. In Berlin, the 1931 radio exhibition unveiled a marvel of modern science, the world's first demonstration of digital television. Crowds gathered in awe as moving images flickered across screens, Proof that even in times of fear and instability, innovation refused to die. This strange coexistence of collapse and creation defined the early 1930s, a world standing on the edge of both ruin and rebirth. In Germany, the failure of the Prussian referendum momentarily preserved the democratic order, but it also revealed how deeply divided the nation had become. The streets of Berlin echoed with anger, propaganda, and disillusionment. Every clash, every speech, every election felt like a warning of what was coming. The fragile Weimar Republic had survived yet another storm, but the winds of extremism were growing stronger, and few could foresee just how devastating they would become. As the world outside looked on, some still believed in the promise of democracy, in the idea that reason and unity could prevail over hatred and fear. But others, driven by desperation, pride, or ideology, saw only chaos and sought radical solutions. This conflict of vision was not confined to Germany alone. It was a symptom of a global crisis, one where nations, economies, and ordinary people wrestled with questions of identity, justice, and survival. The story of 1931 was not just about politics. It was about the fragile balance between progress and destruction that defines human history. In retrospect, 1931 stands as a haunting prelude, a year when the world teetered between light and shadow. Germany's streets burned with tension, but its scientists and engineers pushed the boundaries of possibility. Britain's empire trembled, yet its thinkers reshaped modern economics. China's rivers raged, but its people's resilience would lay the foundation for future recovery. The events of that year remind us that history rarely moves in a straight line. It weaves together despair and hope, loss and renewal, showing that even in the darkest moments, humanity keeps moving forward, sometimes blindly, but always determined. As we look back at these turning points, it becomes clear that every decision, every movement, every failure and success in 1931 shaped what came next, a decade that would test the limits of civilization itself. The seeds of both innovation and destruction were planted side by side, and history would soon reveal which would grow stronger. Thank you for joining me in exploring this chapter of our shared past, a time when the world stood on the brink, uncertain of its future, yet still daring to dream. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others who love history as much as you do. Every story we tell helps us understand not just where we came from, but who we are and what kind of world we can still choose to build together.